All right, greetings, young true believers. So today we're talking about Martha Nussbaum and an excerpt from her book, um, "Love's." Don't get old, gang. You forget things like this. Uh, One second here. Love's knowledge, right? And so Nussbaum, in this particular piece, this chapter, it's actually chapter 5 of that book. She wants to defend aesthetic cognitivism against its critics, and not just to defend it, but also point out the extent to which we can derive um, psychological and ethical insights from art, and in this case, particularly literature. She talks about Henry James, who incidentally is the brother of the great American pragmatist philosopher William James. She talks about his novel, The Golden Bowl. She talks about that novel quite a bit in other works of hers on literature. Um, but the editors of your text, the philosophy of literature text, Eileen Johns and Dominic Lopez, they talk briefly about this in the introduction to the chapter on page 313. Quote, Martha Nussbaum defends literature as a source of specifically moral knowledge and training in moral perception. She argues that its inextricable relation of form and content can both convey substantive moral truth and be an exemplar of the attentive care for particulars that is required for responsible moral agency. And uh, against those who would object that, well, look, what Nussbaum and other aesthetic cognitivists are doing is they're assessing literature uh, purely in philosophical terms. They're not assessing it as art per se, and it deserves to be assessed as art on its own terms, right? Nussbaum replies, or she would reply, uh, that the goals of the novelist and the moral philosopher can converge, and that's to me undeniably true. It just seems obvious, right? And that a novel's philosophical achievements do contribute to its value as a novel. Um, Indeed, I think I would go further than that. I would say that a novel with no ethical or philosophical insights is frankly a rather thin novel and not particularly worth reading, in my estimation, right? Um, so Nussbaum, she goes into great detail about the, the 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 language that is used throughout the Golden Bowl to relay uh, the moral character and the moral psychology of the characters, right? Um, This is page 333 of the text. Quote, we can say, first, that no description less specific than this could convey the rightness of this action. Second, that any change in the description, even at the same level of specificity, seems to require producing a different act. So she's talking about this passage in which the two protagonists, the father Adam, he's come face to face with the realization that his daughter is now a adult woman who is an agent. She can make her own choices, a free agent, and that she also has a an intimate life, right? And the words that James uses to convey this understanding between the two. The words he uses are sparse. There aren't many, but it's extremely effective, right? And that's what Nussbaum's on about here, right? She goes on to note that any change in the description, even at the same level of specificity, seems to risk producing a different act, or at least requires us to question the sameness of the act. And she goes on to note, furthermore, a paraphrase such as the one as I have produced, even when reasonably accurate, so a paraphrase of what's going on in a novel is what she's talking about. She's offered that in her description. Um, the paraphrase does not ever succeed in displacing the original prose, for it is not, being a high work of literary art, devoid of a richness of feeling and a rightness of tone and rhythm that characterize the original, whose cadences stamp themselves inexorably on the heart. A good action is not flat and toneless and lifeless like my paraphrase, whose use of the standing terms of moral discourse, words like mutual sacrifice, make it too blunt for the highest value. It is, quote, an alert winged creature, soaring above these terms in flexibility and lucidity of vision. the only way to paraphrase this passage without loss of value would be to write another work of art. So here, Nussbaum touches on something that's extremely important, and I think is a major point on behalf of the aesthetic cognitivists that's often overlooked by their critics. It's one thing to convey moral truths in the manner in which, say, Aristotle does in Nicomachean Ethics, or Kant does in the Critique of Practical Reason, or Mill does, or Bentham in their various works, in which it's just a flat, terse description of human behavior. And that's effective and it has its value, but so much more so, and this is Nussbaum's point, so much more effective is it to render moral truths in a setting in which one can empathize with the characters, see them as human beings in real situations, in concrete situations in which human beings have to make difficult moral choices. If you can do that, if a writer can effectively do that, then so much the better, right? It's just a much more effective medium for conveying moral truths, right? So here, toward the end of her particular passage, this particular chapter, right, Nussbaum, she addresses a really pertinent criticism, a fair criticism, right? She notes, this is page 339, talking again about the characters. Is there any sense to claiming that the consciousness of a Maggie Verver or a Struther can be paradigmatic of our own responsible conduct? In short, right, quote, where on earth, where round about us at this hour, has James found such super subtle fry, right? And if they are not found, but squeezed out from coarser matter by the pressure of the artist's hand, how can he be exemplary for us? But James has a response. He grants first that he cannot easily cite such examples from daily life. But on the other hand, these characters do not go far beyond actual life, so far beyond actual life, that their lucidity makes them, quote, spoiled for us. And James goes on, quote, knowing too much and feeling too much, for the remaining natural and typical, for their having the needful communities with our own precious liability to fall into traps and be bewildered. And Nussbaum notes, like Aristotle's tragic heroes, they are high, but possible and available. So they aren't, in other words, superhuman, right? Even being fictional. So much so that they can be said to be, quote, in essence, an observed reality. And if the life around us today does not show us abundance of such examples, then so much the worse for that life. We may not be able to convey our moral truths to one another in such splendid prose as, say, a Tolkien or a James or any other great fiction writer. Names escape me today, but nevertheless, that doesn't mean there aren't such examples in real life. They might not be quite as eloquent, but it's there. And it's ironic but true that we can look to fiction to fill in the gaps in our own moral understanding.